Let's see. Andy, let's get this going. There we go. Solving the Exodus Mystery. So that's what we're studying. It's a 9-week class. We have one class already under our belt, so we have 8 more, counting today, 7 more after today. We are studying this book right here, Solving the Exodus Mystery by Ted Stewart. Ted Stewart was a teacher at the Sunset Bible Institute in Lubbock years ago. He wrote this book about 1999. And it's really, really good book. And so we're studying through this. If you want to have a copy of this book, then go buy one. Yeah, it's on Amazon. Just order it. Solving the Exodus Mystery, Ted Stewart. You'll get the book in a couple of days. It'll be a notification, on whatever device you have, and it'll tell you go look on your door. Yes.
You go right to Sunset and order from them and not give Amazon any of your money.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
So you can go to Sunset Bookstore?
But they have a bookstore, so you can get it right from there.
Yeah. Yeah, Ted Stewart used to own the Sunset Bookstore, which was across the parking lot from the Sunset Church of Christ building.
I didn't know that.
That's okay. Yeah. But if you'd like to have that, you can have it. Now, I also got 3 copies of this book, this is a DVD, Patterns of Evidence Exodus. It's not done by the same person. This one was done it came out last year, or early this year. And it doesn't cover the same things as the book. The book is better. It's more detailed and some stuff. This guy, he would have had a better documentary if he had read Ted Stewart's book. He would have really had a great documentary. But there are some things in here that coincide with what he's saying, and they come to the same conclusions, which is kind of important. So, this is going to be on the back table, and there's a little piece of paper on here for you to put your name and the date that you brought it, and then we'll cross your name out when you bring it back. That way we can know where it is. And that'll be on the back table. So right now I'm going to go ahead and give this to my secretary for the day. My secretary has all the handouts right here also. Today's notes, the notes for today's lesson. I'm not giving them out yet though, because I don't want you sitting there reading them. I want you to listen, and I want you to watch and pay attention, and then you can go home and you'll probably need to anyway, to go home and look it over. So, okay, so that's our introductory plugs on things. I'm going to tell you that I'll probably be sticking pretty close to my notes because we're under a time constraint, and I want to be able to finish this lesson. And if I just put up slides and ramble around about them like I'm doing now, we won't have time. So, with that said, all right, this is, let's see, I'm going to put this here. Yeah, okay, no, go back. This is part 2. Last week was part 1. This is part 2, correcting the dates. So a little review. Biblical archaeologists have failed to link some Bible stories with historical facts, especially during this time period from Abraham through the Exodus. The kings that Abraham met up with, the ancient kings of the East that he had associations with and warred with and stuff like that, don't line up with our accepted dates for Abraham. It's about 200 years off or something like that. And so they're saying, well, I don't know, I don't think that really happened. Some people are saying that. Also, Egyptian history has no room for Moses and Israel at our accepted dates, the dates that we have standard biblical chronology today. So Ted Stewart has suggested that our accepted dates are incorrect. And so he set out to see how this could be lined up and what would make it so. So when the timetable is corrected, then it becomes possible to link biblical stories or biblical events with the historical events in their time period. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is correcting those dates. So let's look again at the established date for the Exodus that we talked about last week. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. And by the way, if you have trouble seeing because you sit so far back, I don't guess I need to say any more about that. Exodus 6 and 1 Kings 6 verse 1 says that the Exodus was 480 years prior to the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So it's talking about the temple, and in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, then this or that happened concerning that. But this date, 966, is well established as the 4th year of Solomon's reign. And so, spoiler alert if you're thinking, oh, but we're going to find out that's not true. No, it is. This is very well established. It is confirmed by 10 astronomically calculated dates that connect the reigns of biblical kings to 8 different Assyrian and Babylonian kings. Astronomical dates. I mean, those things, they just are, and they happen when they happen, and they it can even be, they're all so predictable and stuff that you can even calculate right back to that time, even now. These 10 links were found by Edwin Thiel in the ancient records of Assyria and Babylon. And I remember when I was in school, I used to go to a bookstore down in the Dallas Metroplex area, a Bible bookstore, and I bought Edwin Thiel's book way back then. Of course, I didn't know anything about all this controversy, but it was very interesting about how he discovered these things in the records of Assyria and Babylon. These astronomical dates are linked to 9 eclipses of the sun that are recorded in Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian histories. So there's a lot of checks and cross-checks and counter-checks on this date of 966. The Cambridge Ancient History has accepted Thiel's dates of Solomon's 4th year, and Stewart has no dispute concerning the date of 1446 as the year of the Exodus, 1446 BC. And so we're going to stick with that. We're going to put that as a benchmark. We're going to say, there we are. That's when it should be, according to all the records of the East and Assyrian and Babylonian history and all that kind of stuff. And it lines up with Abraham and everything if we have this date, 1446. The problem begins with the mistranslation of Exodus 12 and verse 40. This was the thing that was hard for me. Although I studied this years ago and accepted this, and for years I have accepted the conclusions that Ted Stewart came to here. But this passage says, this is from the New International Version, it says, now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. That's what it says in the New International Version. There is no place in Egyptian history for Canaanite slaves to have been in Egypt for this many years. In Egyptian history, there are times when you see Canaanite people, and especially Hebrew Canaanite people that were in the land, but you never see this 430-year stretch. And that's why they're saying, well, this is not true, because we just don't find this length of time. So trying to plug this timetable into Egyptian history has been vain and unnecessary, because that isn't a good translation of that. You go, oh, wow. Well, then, how do you know that? Well, because of what Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. Paul didn't interpret Exodus 12, verse 40, the same way that our modern translators translated it. You say, what do you mean translated? Well, Paul quotes that passage. He quotes from Exodus 12 and verse 40, and yet here's what he said. He said, the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The law, introduced 430 years later, does not set aside the covenant previously established by God and thus do away with the promise. So he's making a big point here about the covenants and the promises, but inadvertently he also throws in this number of 430. But he doesn't relate that to the time that Jacob entered into the land, 430 years from the Israelites coming into the land of Egypt to the Exodus. He relates the 430 years back to the promises spoken to Abraham, the call of Abraham. 430 years from the call of Abraham to the Exodus. You say, well, it doesn't say the Exodus, it says the law. Well, the law was given the same year as the Exodus. Right? The people of Israel came out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. Where did they go? They went straight to Mount Sinai, and God gave them the law. So that's the same year. So the Exodus and the law is the same thing. So Paul says it was 430 years from the call of Abraham until the Exodus, from the call of Abraham. It didn't begin with Jacob entering into the land of Egypt, or Joseph entering into the land of Egypt, or anybody else entering into the land of Egypt. Paul says the 430 years started with God's calling Abram and giving him promises. So modern translators have rendered Exodus 12, verse 40, in conflict with their own rendering of Galatians 3, 16 and 17. So the archaeologists have been looking for Joseph in the wrong place and in the wrong time period. You say, well, okay, what else you got? You got any other evidence about this? Well, Josephus, the Jewish historian, in his writings said, talking about the Israelites, they left Egypt in the month Xanthicus, 430 years, Josephus said, after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan. So he relates the Exodus with Abraham and the number 430 from Abraham and not from Jacob. And he goes on and says that they left Egypt, the Exodus was 215 years after Jacob removed into Egypt. So where would we be looking then for Joseph? We'd be looking for Joseph somewhere in the middle of that 430 years and not way over here at the beginning of it. So we have what Paul said about that 430 years. We have what Josephus said. Also the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible done by 70 Jewish scholars in the year 250 BC. It was ordered by the Egyptian king Ptolemy II. He got these 70 Jewish scholars to take the Hebrew Bible and translate it into Greek in 250 BC. And the Septuagint says, is this in your way, this thing here? You know, I don't really need it because I'm just holding this and reading it, okay? So the Septuagint says the sojourning of the sons of Israel in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. So their sojourning, not just the length of time they were in Egypt, 430 years, but the time they were in Canaan and Egypt, 430 430 years. So it wasn't necessary for modern translators to render Exodus 12 verse 40 as they did. If you look at this term up here, length of time right there, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt, this term length of time is the Hebrew word moshab, which means to dwell. Now, the dwelling of the Israelite people. It's also linked and akin to the word toshab, which means to sojourn. The sojourning of the Israelite people is related to 430 years. Now, let's look at 6 translations of Exodus 12, verse 40. The King James Version says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, comma, who dwelt in Egypt, comma, was 430 years." So there's this parenthetical clause, a descriptive clause, of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt. Now, what children of Israel? The ones who dwelt in Egypt. But if you take the explanatory clause out, the sentence just says the sojourning of the children of Israel was 430 years. The Septuagint said the sojourning of the sons of Israel while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years. This term sojourning here. Okay, here are 6 passages in the Bible where the term sojourning relates to the children of Israel as they were in the land of Canaan. They were sojourning in Canaan as they were sojourning in Egypt. And so some of these translations try to make that clear. The New King James Version says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. The New American Standard has a footnote that puts in the idea of the sons of Israel who dwelt in Egypt. But when you come on down to the New International, the New American Bible, and lots of other English translations, they don't have the word who in there. Who is omitted from these renditions? It's the Hebrew word asher. It's actually there. It should be there. It should come across, but it isn't brought across in the New International Version. They just say the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. So we have taken that and we've plugged that into our timetable, and it's thrown the timetable way off. But let's just ask a question. Okay, was the Exodus 430 years after the call of Abraham? Is there any way that we can check that biblically? Well, let's take a look at this idea. Here's another key scripture. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. And it says, this is God speaking to Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be slaves. They will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years." Now, let's say we apply the same logic that we did before with the 430 years, and that the 400 years here involves 3 things. They will be strangers in a country not their own. They will be enslaved. They will be mistreated. All of these things would total to 400 years. Now, he's not including Abraham in this promise. God starts with his descendants. Your descendants are going to be 400 years misplaced or sojourners. So the first descendant of Abraham was Isaac. Okay, so Isaac is going to be the first in line here. Was the Exodus 400 years after the birth of Isaac? Is there any way we could calculate that? Well, if the Exodus is 430 years after the call of Abraham, as we saw in Galatians a while ago. And if the Exodus is 400 years after the birth of Isaac, then there should be 30 years between the call of Abraham and the birth of Isaac, biblically speaking. So we ask the question, was there 30 years between the birth of Abraham and the birth of Isaac? This is a way to kind of counter-check whether all of these dates begin with Abraham and begin with Isaac. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4 says that Abram was 75 years when he entered into Canaan. And Genesis 21:5 says that Abram was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So there's a 25-year difference from the time that Abraham came into, this is the land of Canaan. From the time that Abraham came into the land of Canaan until Isaac was born, 25 years there. Okay, so where's the other 5 years? If it was 30 years between the call of Abraham and the birth of Isaac, where's the other 5 years? Well, here's some passages. Genesis 15:7 says that God's call to Abram was when he lived where? In Ur of the Chaldeans. Okay, so here's Ur over here. We don't want to err in these miscalculations. No, anyway. So he lived in Ur. He was called when he lived in Ur. And it says in Genesis 11 that Abram and Terah, his father, settled in the land of Haran. So they didn't go directly to the land of Canaan. They came from Ur up to Haran. And then it says in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is retelling this story, he said they stayed in Haran until Terah died. And when Terah died, then Abram came down and settled into Canaan and lived in Canaan at that time. You know, I'm telling you, it's very probable that they sojourned in Haran for 5 years. That they left Ur, they went to Haran, they stayed there 5 years, and then they came on to Jerusalem. Thus, God's call to Abram came when he was 70 years old. Isaac was born when Abram was 100 years old. Okay, so that's a difference of 30 years. So I'm going to stop right there. Abram was 75 when he entered Canaan. Abram was 100 when Isaac was born. 25 years from the time he entered Canaan until Isaac was born. And if he sojourned for 5 years in Haran, then from 75 you take 5, he was 70 whenever he was called. And he was 100 when Isaac was born. That's 30 years. So therefore, the birth of Isaac, 30 years removed from the call of Abram, the birth of Isaac, it says in this passage, was 400 years after the Exodus, or before the Exodus. 430 years from the call of Abram to the Exodus, 400 years from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus. Not 400 years from Joseph entering into Egypt or Jacob entering into Egypt, but from the call of Abram and from the birth of Isaac. And those are scriptures from Galatians and from the book of Genesis that we have there. So let's plug this into our biblical timetable here. All right. By the way, this is the last lesson that has this kind of stuff. You have to get the timetable, and I know we don't like it. And you're going to get these exact notes I have. You can take them. You can double check them if you want. But he's right. He is right here. So let's take a lesson. Let's take a look here. If the Exodus is well established at 1446, and the call of Abram was 430 years prior to the Exodus, then that would be the year 1876 BC that Abraham was called, or Abram was called. All right, so if Abram was in Canaan when he was at age 75, so that was 5 years later that he came to the land of Canaan. That would have been the year 1871. Isaac was born when Abe was 100 years old. So here he was 75 years old here. He's 100 years old here. 21 years. If he was entering into the land in 1871 and Isaac is born 25 years later, then that would be 1846 BC. And then Isaac is born to Jacob Jacob was born to Isaac when Isaac was 60 years old. So we have 1846, and we factor in the 60-year period there. That's 1786. Jacob told Pharaoh that he was 130 years old when he moved into the land. He said, your servant is now 130 years old. Well, if Jacob was born in 1786 BC, and he was 130 when he entered into the land, then Jacob entered into the land of Canaan in the year 1656 BC. So we have scriptures that tell all of these ages and all these times. It's just a simple matter of arithmetic to get down to that point. Simple. Just simple arithmetic. Okay, so let's see. So how long were Jacob's descendants in Egypt? Well, you take when Jacob entered in 1656, and you take away the year of the Exodus, 1446, 210 years. They were in Egypt 210 years. So what about this 210-year sojourn of Israel in Egypt? It's internal biblical evidence that gives us these numbers and gives us these dates even. So it's internal biblical evidence and also internal evidence from Assyrian and Babylonian history books and dates and stuff that coincide and makes all of this line up with each other. In the Babylonian Talmud, the book of Megillah, page 9, it records that Israel's stay in Egypt was 210 years. So the Babylonian Talmud also coincides with the figures that we've come up with here from the Bible. Today, if you were to go into schools over in Israel and listen to the rabbinical teachings that are taught to the children there, they teach them that Israel lived in Egypt 210 years. So this is not some far-fetched thing that Ted Stewart has come up with. He's just thought it through, put it all together, and everything begins to line up now. Now, let's look at modern translations of Exodus 20 and how it throws everything off. Let's see, I need to put one more thing on here. Let's look at the biblical timetable here. All right, here we go again. This is the biblical timetable. This is the timetable as it would be according to the New International Version, using Exodus, saying that Exodus 12, verse 40, saying that it was 480 years that the children of Israel were in the land. But here's our biblical timetable that we've just come up with. The biblical timetable says that the 430 years was from the call of Abram. 430 years from the call of Abram to the Exodus. And that would have been the year 1876. But the modern translations are saying that the 430 years was from Jacob entering into Egypt, that the entire time that the Israelites were in the land was 430 years. And so if you take this timetable here, you come up with Jacob entering the land of Egypt in 1876 rather than Abram being called in 1876. And that would then put the call of Abram in the year 2096 BC. How different is that? Well, about 200 years. It throws it off by about 200 years. And so you find history showing that the walls of Jericho fell down about 200 years before Joshua got there. That's what history is saying. So therefore, the story of Joshua isn't true. And it doesn't have Abraham lining up with the kings of the east. All of that, those kings that he met up with were 200 years before. But when you shift everything and you have a different length of time, instead of being 430 years that the Israelites were in the land, they were only there 210 years. Then all of a sudden we have Abraham's date of 1876 lining back up again with the kings of the east that he met. I'll let you think about that for a second. So, anyway, they're looking for Abraham and Joseph at the wrong place in history. That's why they're not finding them. And that's why they're saying, well, it's not true. And it goes back to that misinterpretation. So, if you can take it, if you can handle it just for another minute, we'll make one last final adjustment to our timetable. And this time, let's go ahead and put Joseph into the timetable. And this word vizier, this first time you're seeing that, that is the word that the historians use for the advisors to the pharaohs. They were their viziers. It's like you go to a hotel and you got a concierge. But this is the vizier. So let's take a look here at our established date, the Exodus 14:46. And Jacob is in Egypt 210 years before the Exodus. So Jacob enters into the land in 1656. That happens to be the end of the second year of famine. You remember? There were 7 years of abundance, and then there was a year of famine. There was another year of famine before Jacob and his family finally moved to Egypt because they discovered that Joseph is still alive and all that, okay? So Jacob enters in at the end of the second year of famine. Well, if he entered in the year 1656, that's also the year of the second year of famine, the end of the second year of famine. So the first year of plenty would have been 9 years prior to that. 7 years of abundance, and then 2 years of famine. So we take our number of Jacob coming into Egypt as 1656, and we're going to factor in the 9 years of 7 of abundance, 2 of famine. And so the first year of plenty would be 1665. Okay, just simple arithmetic there. Well, it just so happens that the first year of plenty was also the first year that Joseph was vizier, because he was appointed to be the assistant to Pharaoh. He predicts 7 years of plenty, and the 7 years of plenty begin at that time. So Joseph's first year as vizier would also be the same thing as the first year of plenty. Joseph started as vizier in 1665. These numbers are the same. These numbers are the same. They coincide with things here. Joseph was 30 years old whenever he was made vizier. That's according to Genesis chapter 41, verse 46. So if he was 30 years old on this year, and the Bible says in Genesis 37 that Joseph was 17 when he went into Egypt. That's a 13-year difference. He was in Egypt 13 years before he was appointed to be second in command of Pharaoh. So if his first year of this year was 1665, 13 years prior to that would have been 1678 that Joseph came in as a slave, as a child of 17 years old. Okay, so the total time span the Hebrews were in Egypt would be from Joseph's entering into the land in 1678 until Jacob left, until the Exodus. Wait a minute. What are we looking at? The total time the Hebrews were there would be from the time that Joseph came in. I'm ahead of myself. Joseph was in Egypt 22 years before Jacob arrived. Because Jacob arrived in 1656. Joseph arrived in 1678. So I'm just looking at the time difference between Joseph and Jacob there. Now, Jacob and his descendants lived in Egypt 210 years from 1446, from 1656 to 1446. So the total span that the Hebrews lived in Egypt was from the time that Joseph arrived. That's what I was really wanting to get to anyway. From the time that Joseph arrived until the Exodus, 232 years. I would never have been able to figure that out myself. But, whenever you're an obsessed guy and it's your hobby and you spend years and years just reading everything, taking notes and everything, you start going, oh, yeah, all those dates are right there in the Bible, and so we can add it all up. So anyway, let's put it on the chart here. What's the total time span the Hebrews were in Egypt? Let's go on up here. 232 years from Joseph entering into Egypt until the Exodus. Put that on our timeline. 210 years from the time that Jacob entered in, from 1656 to 1446. We'll just put that on the timeline. So here is where we should be looking for Joseph in Egyptian history rather than, 200 years prior to that. So we're going to leave those dates as they are, and we'll factor them in next time. But I have just one more question real quick today. And that is, what about the growth rate? Is the biblical growth rate possible for this span of time? Could they have achieved a large enough nation in 210 years? Genesis 46 says that there were 68 sons and grandsons of Jacob who entered into Egypt. Okay? It just counts the men. 68 men who came into Egypt during the days of famine. Exodus 12 verse 37 says that there were 600,000 men who left Egypt during the Exodus, besides the women and children. So from 68 men to 600,000 men, we would say, in 210 years. But, the guys that figure this kind of birth rate stuff say, well, you've got to figure in the fact that these 600 men in Exodus 12 were at least 20 years old, it says in Numbers 1, verse 3. It says there were 600,000 men who were of fighting age. Fighting age was 20. That was what they considered. So therefore, you got to take off the 20. See, I don't know how to figure birth rates, growth rates. I don't know how to figure that. But there are people that do it all the time, and they figure it out, and they say, well, you got to take off the 20, so you have to have from 68 men to 600,000 men in 190 years. Is that possible? Well, these same experts in this figure say that that growth rate would then be 4.9%. A growth rate of 4.9%. If you thought that other calculations was complicated, I have no idea how the experts that figure this. But you know, Ted Stewart was writing this in the 1990s, and so he used the 1990 census. You know what the growth rate in the United States was in 1990? 0.9%. And we go, whoa. Is that even possible to have a 4.9% growth rate in only 190 years? Well, the United States is a little different than other places. If you look at some other places in the world in 1990, like Saudi Arabia, Kenya, Malawi, you start seeing growth rates of 4%, 4.2%, 5.3%, even 6% growth rate. In 1990, there were countries that had a growth rate greater than the growth rate that Israel would have had at 4.9%. So you say, is it possible for them to have grown to that number in that 210-year period? Yeah, it's possible. It would have been just about the right length of time, actually, for that to have happened. So, today, I'm going to read this here. This is the last paragraph. It says, C-O-N-C, conclude. Today we have set up a dated chronology of events relating to the Exodus, which is in accord with both biblical records and astronomical dating records. The biblical timetable allows for Israel's sojourn in Egypt to be 210 years at least and 232 years at most, if you count Joseph entering as well. We have seen that it is truly possible for Israel to grow to a mighty nation in that amount of time. This biblical chronology from Abraham to Exodus will allow us to recognize a host of synchronisms between biblical history and Egyptian history. Ted Stewart finds over 400 synchronisms between the history that's recorded in the Bible and what is recorded in Egyptian history in the 12th dynasty, beginning with I always say Amenemhet, but it's Amenemhet. Amenemhet. I'll get this better next week. From Amenemhet the first, the 12th dynasty begins all the way through Amenemhet the fourth. And there's a bunch of Sesostris, the first, second, third, in there too. That the 12th dynasty is this length of, the right length of time, the right circumstances. We'll see Joseph next week in the history. No more chronology, no more numbers. We're going to get out of the fun part where we really look into the history of these, of Egypt and the biblical story. Okay, Steve?
You talked about the two possibilities. Is that dynasty one of those two possibilities, or does that fall in between there somewhere? Or
Two possibilities for what?
For the two possibilities for the Exodus. Remember you had two dates that were two possibilities for the Exodus? Does the date that you're following here, is it one of those, or is it a totally different one?
It's totally different.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not either one of those, really.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know, the video that we're going to put out there, it shows how the timetable in Egypt, how it could be shifted and slid into place. And the answer that they give in the video is that they have these, there's the early Egyptian history, middle Egyptian history, and then later, the last Egyptian history. They're in big periods and chunks. And they have these long, dark periods where they don't have any history. They don't know how long those long chunks of history were between early, middle, and later Egyptian history. And he says if they're calculating those lengths of time to be longer than they really are, then all of that could be slid some within those dark periods, and it lines up. That's pretty interesting the way they figure it out. But I don't know how interested you are in this, but starting next week, it's going to start getting way more fun. Okay. I guess that's it.